My wife cheated on me with her rich boss, got pregnant, when I found out she tried to hide everything but then. Hey Reddit, I never thought I'd find myself here, but I need advice on something that's turned my life upside down. My name's Mike, 36, and I've been married to Jessica, 34, for nearly 10 years. On the surface, our life seemed perfect. We have a beautiful home, no kids, Jessica always said she wasn't ready, and decent jobs. I'm a sales manager, and she's an assistant at a big financial firm. But lately, things haven't been right. It all started a few months ago. Jessica's behavior changed overnight. She used to be home by 6 p.m., but now she works late all the time. When she's home, she's glued to her phone, acting distant, always laughing at messages she won't share. Our intimacy has dropped to nearly zero, and she avoids my questions like a politician dodging a scandal. I've seen enough Reddit stories to know something isn't right. I feel like I'm going crazy, and I don't want to accuse her of anything without proof. I need advice. Should I investigate further? Confront her? Or am I overthinking all of this? So, I decided to trust my gut. A few weeks ago, while Jessica was working late yet again, I got curious and checked our shared credit card statements. I wasn't looking for anything specific, just wanted to see if there was anything out of the ordinary. That's when I found it: charges from fancy restaurants I knew we hadn't been to, and worse, 2 separate bookings at a high-end hotel downtown. One charge was from 2 weeks ago, and another one was from just last weekend, both on nights she claimed to be at the office. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. Still, I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was work-related, maybe it was nothing. But deep down, I knew something was off. I thought back to her recent behavior, how she'd been dressing up more, how she suddenly started going to the gym after years of not caring much about it. And that phone, she never let it out of her sight anymore. It was like a slow-motion car crash I couldn't stop. But I needed proof before I confronted her. Something told me that Jessica wasn't going to admit anything without it. The following week, something strange happened, completely by accident. Jessica was in the shower, and she had left her phone charging on the kitchen counter. Normally, she's super protective of it, but for once, she wasn't around to guard it. I knew it was now or never. My heart was pounding as I unlocked her phone. She'd given me the passcode years ago, back when we trusted each other. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to find, but it didn't take long to confirm my worst fears. Her texts were filled with messages from a contact saved under boss. That wasn't odd at first. She's mentioned her boss, David, plenty of times. But these messages weren't about work. Last night was incredible. I can't stop thinking about you, one message said. Another, when can we sneak away again? I couldn't believe it. My wife was having an affair with her boss. It felt like my entire world had just collapsed in an instant. I stood there frozen, reading the disgusting back and forth between them, her gushing over how he made her feel, and how she wished they didn't have to hide. I realized the fancy dinners and hotel stays weren't just for work, they were with him. I quickly put the phone back where I found it, my mind spinning. How could she do this? And with her boss of all people? I didn't know whether to scream, cry, or confront her right there. But I wasn't ready to face her just yet. Not until I had a plan. I spent the next few days in a fog, trying to act normal around Jessica while my mind was racing. Every time I looked at her, I wanted to explode. But I knew better than to confront her without a solid plan. If I just charged at her with accusations, she'd lie, deflect, or twist the narrative. So, I took a deep breath and decided to be smart about it. First, I started gathering more evidence. I downloaded a tracking app on her phone, discreetly set up to track her location. It felt wrong, like I was betraying her privacy, but after what I'd seen on her phone, I knew I couldn't just sit back and wait for her to come clean. I needed to know the full extent of her betrayal. Then, I contacted a lawyer. I wasn't sure if I was ready to divorce her yet, but I wanted to know my options. The lawyer told me I needed undeniable proof, especially if her affair involved her boss, which could impact any legal settlements or alimony. That only solidified my decision to keep gathering evidence. I wasn't just going to barge in and give her a chance to wiggle out of this. I felt sick every time I looked at her. She was still coming home late, dressing up, acting like everything was fine between us. Little did she know that I was silently preparing for the moment I'd confront her with everything. The more I watched her, the more I wondered, how long had this been going on? Was I just a stepping stone until she could find someone with more money and power? I knew one thing for sure: the confrontation was coming. And when it did, she wasn't going to be able to lie her way out of this. A week after I installed the tracking app, I finally got what I was looking for. One evening, Jessica told me she had a late meeting and wouldn't be home until 9 p.m. I played along, nodding and acting like I believed her, but inside, I was ready. As soon as she left, I pulled out my phone and watched her location ping. She wasn't headed to the office. Instead, she drove straight to that same high-end hotel where those mysterious charges had come from. I stared at the screen for what felt like hours, waiting to see if she'd leave, hoping maybe there was some innocent explanation. But deep down, I knew there wasn't. I couldn't sit around any longer. I grabbed my keys, drove to the hotel, and parked in the lot. My heart was racing as I saw her car parked in front. I stood there for a moment, wondering what I'd do if I actually saw them. I had the option of walking in, catching them red-handed, but something stopped me. Was I really ready to face this head-on? Instead, I waited in my car, watching from a distance. After about an hour, I saw them. Jessica and her boss, David, walking out of the hotel together. They were laughing, completely oblivious to the fact that I was sitting right there. She kissed him on the cheek, and they got into separate cars. My hands gripped the steering wheel so hard that my knuckles turned white. I didn't follow her home. I couldn't. I sat there, in the parking lot, feeling numb. The woman I'd loved for nearly a decade was betraying me in the most heartless way possible, and she didn't even seem to care. I wasn't ready to confront her yet, but I knew I couldn't let this go on much longer. The breaking point had come, and soon, there would be no turning back. When Jessica got home that night, I was sitting in the living room, pretending to watch TV. My heart was pounding, but I kept my face neutral. She walked in, greeted me casually, and went straight to the kitchen to grab some water, as if she hadn't just been out with another man. I watched her, feeling a surge of anger. But I held it in. I needed to keep my cool until I had everything in place. For now, I wanted to see how far she'd go with her lies. So, I asked her, how was work? Late meeting again? She didn't even flinch. Yeah, it was long. We're trying to wrap up a big project, so it's been crazy. She smiled at me, that same sweet smile I'd fallen for years ago, but now it felt fake, like a mask she wore to hide the truth. I nodded, pretending to buy her story, even though I'd just seen her walk out of a hotel with her boss. It amazed me how easily she lied, how effortlessly she could look me in the eye and pretend everything was normal. For the next few days, I continued to gather more evidence. I didn't confront her right away, but I couldn't stop watching her, analyzing every move, every word she said. It was like living with a stranger. The person I thought I knew was gone, replaced by someone who could lie without hesitation. It was painful, but I needed more proof, more leverage before I made my move. The storm was brewing, and I knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. Just when I thought I had seen enough, something else happened that threw me completely off balance. One morning, while Jessica was in the shower, her phone lit up with a message from David, her boss. Normally, I wouldn't have looked, but after everything I'd found, I couldn't help myself. I picked up the phone, and what I saw changed everything. The message wasn't the usual flirty banter between them. It said, "How are you feeling today? Have you decided what you're going to do about the baby?" The baby. I felt my chest tighten. A baby? I scrolled back through their conversation, and there it was, Jessica was pregnant, and from the looks of it, David was the father. They had been discussing what to do, and she hadn't made a decision yet. My world was spinning. Not only had she cheated on me with her boss, but now there was a baby involved. A baby that wasn't mine. I stood there, phone in hand, feeling like the ground had just dropped out from under me. I hadn't expected this. The affair was one thing, but this was a whole new level of betrayal. The bathroom door opened, and Jessica stepped out, towel wrapped around her, humming to herself like nothing had changed. I quickly put the phone down, my mind racing. I couldn't look at her the same way anymore. She had no idea I knew everything, about the affair, the lies, and now, the baby. After discovering Jessica's pregnancy, I was completely numb. I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus at work, and barely managed to keep myself from breaking down every time I saw her. I kept replaying that message in my head, the baby. A constant reminder of her betrayal. Jessica, on the other hand, was acting completely normal. She had no idea that I knew everything. Every day, she went about her routine like nothing had changed, working late, texting David, pretending like she still cared about our marriage. It was sickening. I had so many questions swirling in my mind. How long had she known about the pregnancy? Was she planning to tell me eventually? Was she going to leave me for David? The thought of her carrying his child while living under our roof was too much to bear, but I wasn't ready to confront her yet. Not until I figured out my next move. In the evenings, we barely spoke. I couldn't bring myself to even make small talk with her, and I could tell she noticed. She'd ask if something was wrong, and I'd shrug it off, pretending I was stressed from work. I could see her starting to grow more distant, and I realized she was probably preparing to end things on her own terms. But I wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. I had one last thing I needed to do before the confrontation, a final piece of evidence that would leave no room for excuses or lies. Something that would make her face the full weight of what she'd done. I knew I couldn't wait much longer to confront Jessica. With the pregnancy hanging over me like a dark cloud, I needed to be sure of one thing, whether or not the baby was David's. I couldn't stand the thought of facing her without knowing the truth. So, I decided to take things a step further. I managed to clone her phone using an app one found online, allowing me to see all her messages, photos, and even emails in real time. It felt invasive, wrong, but at this point, I needed to protect myself. There was no turning back. The next day, while she was out at work, I scrolled through the cloned messages. That's when I found exactly what I was looking for. David had sent her an email, titled "Doctor's Appointment." My heart raced as I opened it. The email was short but confirmed my suspicions. David had gone with her to a prenatal appointment, and the results were clear: he was the father. They had been discussing how to handle things, with Jessica torn between keeping the baby and terminating the pregnancy. David, predictably, was pressuring her to keep it quiet. This was it. There was no more uncertainty, no more wondering if I was wrong. Jessica had been carrying on this affair for months, and now she was pregnant with David's child. All the pieces had fallen into place, and I was left standing in the ruins of our marriage, holding the final piece of proof. The time had come. There was no point in delaying the confrontation any longer. That evening, I decided it was time. I couldn't carry the weight of her lies any longer. She walked through the door, smiling, as if everything was fine. Little did she know this was the last night she'd be pretending. We sat down at the kitchen table, and I took a deep breath, steadying myself for what was about to come. "Jessica, we need to talk." She looked up from her phone, confused, but I could see a flicker of worry cross her face. "What's wrong?" "I know about you and David," I said, my voice calm but shaking inside. Her eyes widened for a moment, but she quickly composed herself. "What are you talking about?" she asked, feigning innocence. Her go-to move: lie, deny, deflect. I pulled out my phone and showed her the messages. "Don't play games, Jessica. I've seen everything. The dinners, the hotel stays, the messages about the baby. I know you're pregnant with his child." Her face went pale, and for the first time, I saw her speechless. She opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out. The silence hung between us like a heavy weight. Finally, she broke down. "Mike, I'm sorry. I didn't mean for this to happen." Her voice cracked as she tried to explain. It got out of control." "Out of control?" I repeated, feeling my anger rising. "You've been sleeping with your boss for months, Jessica. You're carrying his child. How does that just happen?" Tears streamed down her face, but I didn't feel sorry for her. Not this time. She had crossed a line, and there was no coming back from it. "I'm sorry," she kept saying. "I never wanted to hurt you. I don't even know how to fix this." I stood up, unable to listen to any more of her apologies. "There's nothing to fix, Jessica. It's over." The words felt heavy, final. She didn't argue, didn't beg me to stay. She just sat there, crying, knowing that the damage was done and that there was no way out of this mess. After the confrontation, I walked out of the house, leaving Jessica sitting at the table, still crying. I needed air, space to clear my head. The reality of it all hit me hard as I drove aimlessly through the night. This was it, our marriage was over. There was no turning back. I spent the night at a hotel, unable to face going home. The weight of everything, her lies, the affair, the pregnancy, was crushing. I felt betrayed, angry, but mostly, I felt empty. 10 years of marriage, all thrown away for some fling with her boss. And now she was pregnant with his child. How did things fall apart so fast? The next morning, I went to see my lawyer again. I knew divorce was the only option now. We discussed the steps I'd need to take, and I asked about what this would mean for her affair with David, especially since they worked together. My lawyer was optimistic that Jessica's infidelity, combined with the pregnancy, would play in my favor during the divorce proceedings. Over the next few days, I started moving my things out. Jessica tried to talk to me, but I couldn't stand to look at her. She kept apologizing, asking if there was any chance we could work things out, but I knew there was no point. The trust was shattered, and I couldn't forgive her for what she had done. I didn't tell anyone the full story yet. Not our families, not our friends. I wanted to get the divorce rolling first before everything became public. But the isolation was hard. I didn't want to share the pain with anyone, and at the same time, I didn't know how to carry it alone. As I started packing my things and sorting through the wreckage of our life together, more truths began to come out, things Jessica had hidden that went deeper than the affair. One evening, while I was boxing up some old photos, she approached me quietly. I could tell something was weighing on her. "Mike, there's something else I need to tell you," she said, barely able to look me in the eyes. I didn't respond at first. What more could there be? I just stared at her, waiting. David wasn't the first, she finally admitted, her voice shaking. There was someone else, before him. The words hit me like a freight train. My mind struggled to process what she was saying. Another affair? This was last year, she continued, tears welling up in her eyes. It was brief. Someone from the office. It ended quickly, but I can't hide it anymore. I couldn't believe it. All this time, I had been living in a lie much bigger than I'd imagined. I thought the affair with David was a one-off mistake, but now I realized it was part of a pattern. She had been deceiving me long before I even suspected. That's it, Jessica, I said, my voice cold and final. You've been lying to me for years. I thought this was just about David, but now I see the truth. You've never been honest with me, and you never will be. She broke down again, sobbing uncontrollably, but I couldn't feel any sympathy. My mind was numb. This was no longer the woman I thought I had married. This was someone else, someone I didn't even recognize anymore. I walked out of the room without another word, knowing that any chance of salvaging anything from this mess was gone. It wasn't just one betrayal, it was years of lies and deceit unraveling in front of me. As I packed my things and moved into a small apartment across town, the reality of having to tell our families and friends sank in. I couldn't keep it a secret forever. They all knew something was wrong, especially my parents, who had been calling non-stop to check on me. I had been avoiding their questions, too ashamed to admit what had happened. I finally decided to face it and invited my parents over for dinner. It was hard to even know where to start. My mom noticed the tension right away, her eyes darting around the half-empty apartment. "Mike, what's going on? You're not yourself," she asked, concern written all over her face. I took a deep breath and sat them down. "Jessica's been having an affair," I said, the words tasting bitter as I spoke them. "It's been going on for months, and she's pregnant with her boss's child." The silence that followed was suffocating. My mom's hand flew to her mouth in shock, while my dad just sat there, stunned. Neither of them had expected this. They had loved Jessica like their own daughter, and now, like me, they were grappling with the betrayal. "I'm sorry, son," my dad finally said, his voice thick with emotion. "You didn't deserve this." My mom hugged me tight, tears in her eyes, and for the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to feel a little bit of the pain. I hadn't realized how much I needed their support until that moment. Telling Jessica's parents was even harder. I wasn't sure how they'd react, but I knew they had to know the truth. They were shocked and angry, but at Jessica more than me. They apologized, offered support, and even admitted they had noticed changes in her behavior but didn't know how to bring it up. The hardest part was knowing that everyone was hurting because of her choices. Our tight-knit group of friends was also falling apart, people taking sides, and the awkwardness between mutual friends became unbearable. What had once been a shared life was now crumbling into pieces, and there was no turning back. A few days after telling our families, something unexpected happened. I received a call from Jessica. I hadn't spoken to her since I moved out, and honestly, I wasn't in the mood for another emotional conversation. But her voice sounded different, calm, almost resigned. "Mike, I want to meet," she said. "There's something we need to talk about." I wasn't sure what to expect, but curiosity got the best of me. We agreed to meet at a coffee shop, a neutral space away from the chaos of what used to be our home. When I arrived, she was already sitting at a table, looking worn out and defeated. She didn't look like the confident, distant woman I'd confronted just weeks ago. She seemed fragile, vulnerable. "I know I've done horrible things," she began, staring down at her coffee cup. "And I know you'll never forgive me. I don't expect you to. But I've been thinking about the baby." My stomach clenched. I hadn't allowed myself to think about that. The baby that wasn't mine. Her future with David. "I'm not keeping it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "David and we've talked, and we both agreed. It's too complicated. We can't raise this child together." I was stunned. I hadn't expected this. I didn't know how to feel. Relief? Sadness? Anger? Part of me was glad that I wouldn't have to see her raise a child that came from her betrayal. But another part of me was overwhelmed by the weight of her decision. "I'm not telling you this to ask for your forgiveness," she continued. "I just thought you deserved to know. I'm trying to fix my life, Mike. I know I've ruined everything between us, but I don't want to make it worse." I sat there in silence, processing her words. This wasn't a reconciliation, but it felt like a strange kind of closure. Jessica was making her own choices, and for the first time, they didn't involve lying or hiding. She had finally owned up to her mistakes in the most profound way possible. I nodded, unsure of what else to say. "I appreciate you telling me," I managed, still grappling with the flood of emotions. We sat there for a while, not saying much. It wasn't a happy ending, but maybe it was the closest we'd get to some sort of peace. For the first time since this all started, I felt like the chapter was coming to a close, even if it wasn't the ending I had imagined. In the weeks that followed our meeting, I started to feel the weight of everything slowly lift off my shoulders. Jessica went through with her decision, and while we didn't speak much after that, it felt like both of us were finally letting go. There were no more apologies, no more lies, just a quiet, unspoken understanding that what we had was over. The divorce process moved faster than I had expected. With all the evidence of her affair, the legal side was clear-cut. She didn't fight me on much. We split our assets, and I kept the house, which felt like the right decision. I wanted to rebuild my life without having to leave behind everything I had worked for. One evening, after signing the final divorce papers, I stood in what used to be our living room, now stripped of any trace of Jessica. The silence felt different now, not as heavy. It wasn't just the absence of her that made it peaceful, but the feeling of starting over. I thought back on everything, the shock, the lies, the confrontation. At one point, it felt like my life was over, but now, I saw it differently. Jessica's betrayal had shattered the world I thought I knew, but it had also forced me to grow, to face truths I had been ignoring for years. I'd always imagined my life with her, but now, for the first time, I was imagining it without her. And that didn't scare me anymore. I started reconnecting with old friends, focusing on my job, and even picked up new hobbies I hadn't had time for before. It wasn't an overnight recovery, but each day felt a little lighter than the one before. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that no matter how devastating a betrayal can feel, it doesn't define you. The pain fades, and eventually, you find yourself again, stronger, wiser, and more ready to face whatever comes next. For anyone reading this, if you've ever been where I was, my only advice is this: let yourself heal. It takes time, but one day, you'll look back and realize that the end of one chapter doesn't mean the end of your story. It just means a new beginning.